Railroad development got underway in Rhode Island shortly after the first scheduled passenger service in the country began in Charleston, South Carolina in 1830. Rhode Island owed the early arrival of the railroad within its borders to its location along one of the main routes of travel between Boston and New York. Until the early 1820s, the entire trip was made by stagecoach and consumed the better part of 2 days. With the establishment of the steamboat service between Providence and New York in 1822, Providence became the principal gateway for travel between Boston and New York. Their journey began with a 5 or 6 hour stagecoach ride between Boston and Providence, where travelers boarded a steamer for the overnight voyage to New York. Several of the early railroads along the eastern seaboard were built primarily as feeders for steamboat lines. Such was the case with Rhode Island's first two railroads, the Boston and Providence, and the New York Providence and Boston. By the late 1820s, proposals were under consideration for expediting the trip between Boston and Providence by constructing a railroad between the two cities. The Act of Incorporation for the Boston and Providence Railroad was approved by the Massachusetts legislators on June 21, 1831. The Boston and Providence line was placed in service incrementally as the construction proceeded toward Providence. Trains began to run between Boston and Dedham in June 1834, and the railroad reached Canton by mid-September of that year. We are informed by passengers on the Boston stage yesterday, the Providence Journal noted on September 13th, that the cars came over the 15 miles of railroad now completed in 32 minutes. From Canton, passengers were transported to Providence by stagecoach, while construction continued the remainder of the railroad and on the monumental Canton Viaduct over the Neoposset River ravine, an engineering landmark that has been in use for over 165 years. One of the connecting stage lines advertised unrivaled expedition by elegant safety coaches and splendid rail cars via Foxborough, the shortest and most level route to Canton. Thence by railroad cars to Boston through in 4 hours. The first trip over the entire railroad was made on June 2, 1835. This was a special trip by invitation of the directors to show off the railroad to a party of gentlemen, some of whom had come from New York for the occasion. Since the Canton Viaduct was still under construction, 2 trains had to be used, one between Providence and Canton, and one from there to Boston. The train between Canton and Providence was to have been pulled by a new engine that had arrived by boat from Philadelphia the previous day, but unfortunately some of her pipes were not in order, according to the Providence Journal, and horses had to substitute for the first part of the journey. The trip was interrupted twice by mishaps involving the horses, one of which ended up directly under the car, but was extradited without receiving injury other than a few excoriations of shins. By this time, it seemed unanimously resolved that steam power was altogether safer in the propulsion of railroad cars than horsepower, especially for the horses. The trip from Canton to Boston was behind steam in 40 minutes. The guests were taken to Tremont House for dinner and were entertained during the evening at the home of the railroad's president. The return trip the following day was made without incident. The journal concluded its account of the excursion by noting that the new engine was now in operation and it had made several trips over the southern division of the road. The road between Providence and Canton was open to the public on June 15. Through passengers between Providence and Boston were still transported around the unfinished Canton Viaduct by horse-drawn conveyance. The opening of the viaduct on July 28 was reported in the Providence Journal the following day. We are happy to announce the completion of this great work. A train of rail cars came over the road yesterday with some locomotive whistler in 1 hour and 45 minutes. The trails have been laid on the viaduct at Canton. While a railroad bridge was being constructed over the Seekonk River, the trains used a temporary terminal on the river's east side. from which passengers were conveyed to and from Providence in a steamboat was by an omnibus. After the bridge was completed, the trains began using the railroad's India Point terminal, which were located adjacent to the steamboat wharves. Freight service commenced on September 21, when the railroad began carrying merchandise at the rate of 25 cents per 100 pounds, with certain expectations. Among them were straw bonnets, for which the rate was 20 cents per case. According to the advertisement in the journal, articles deemed by the company extra bulky or extra hazardous were taken by special contract only. On December 11, the railroad began carrying mail between Providence and Boston twice a day, as well as handling the mail to and from Boston that was transported between New York and Providence by steamboat. The success of the Boston and Providence was evidenced when its directors declared a dividend of 4% after the railroads had been fully operational for less than 6 months. Although the railroad was a welcome replacement for the tedious and uncomfortable stagecoach ride, travelers on the New York boat often experienced considerable discomfort when a steamer passed through the open water between the mouth of Narragansett Bay and the entrance to Long Island Sound. According to one account, the passengers did not always feel like eating just after the boat struck the long swell of Narragansett beer. But if they could not eat, they could usually drink, and the decanters stood close together down the long table. A remedy for this unpleasantness in the form of a railroad between Providence and Stonington was in progress even while the Boston and Providence was still under construction. At Stonington, New York-bound travelers would be able to board a vessel whose route lay within the calmer waters of Long Island Sound. Although the Stonington Railroad, as it was popularly called, was only 47.5 miles long, its official name, the New York, Providence, and Boston, gave the impression that its tracks covered the entire distance between those cities. Perhaps the New York investors who had financed the road hoped that it might eventually reach New York. Although the prevailing opinion at the time, a railroad could never be built along the Connecticut shore because of the many rivers, inlets, and marshes that would have to be crossed. But the road did spare travelers from Boston an unpleasant boat passage on their way to New York, and to that extent the name was justified. The opening of the road on November 10, 1837, was celebrated with much festivity. A delegation of 100 or more, including the president and directors of the railroad, came up on the steamer Narragansett. They were welcomed to Stonington by the firing of cannon, following which a procession was formed, and with banners flying, they marched with appropriate music to the spacious newly erected public house, which had been built by the railroad, where they partook of a most excellent breakfast. Subsequently, the company left in 2 trains of superb cars, handsomely decorated with miniature American flags. The band played many spirit-stirring airs. By means of the locomotive Stonington and Little Rest, they sped rapidly over the course on the way to Providence. At Providence, the celebrants were joined by additional guests for the trip to Stonington. The trip was accomplished in 2 hours and 25 minutes, which, considering the newness of the road, the little trial that had been made of the engines, TNC, was remarkably expeditious. When the party arrived back in Stonington, a supper for over 400 was served, following which numerous sentiments were called forth. Among the most apt was that of the otherwise unidentified Jacob S. Carpenter, who proclaimed, "Our forefathers refused to pay tribute to Great Britain in former days. Who will consent to pay tribute in this enlightened age to Point Judith, then noted for its turbulent waters, when it can travel the Stonington Railroad?" Paddle steamer like the Narragansett. The SS Narragansett was a passenger paddle steamer of the Stonington line that was burned and sank on June 11, 1880, after a collision with its sister ship, the SS Stonington, in Long Island Sound. The Narragansett had taken on approximately 300 passengers at the North River Pier at J Street in New York City at 5 p.m. Later that evening, at around 11:30 p.m., in heavy fog, she collided with the Stonington near the mouth of the Connecticut River. The Stonington was damaged but was able to return to a port and took no casualties. The Narragansett had a huge gash in the side of her hull, caught fire, and burned rapidly. Many of the passengers were asleep in their staterooms were unable to escape. Significant controversy followed the collision, as the captains of the two ships gave different accounts of the accident and the events leading up to it. The crew of the Narragansett faced accusations of neglect in its duty. Approximately 50 passengers and at least 5 crewmen lost their lives on the Narragansett. Historical note: one of the passengers on the Stonington was Charles S. Gattu, who just over a year later assassinated President James A. Garfield. Gattu was on deck at the time of the collision and afterwards believed they had been miraculously spared to punish Garfield. Also, one of the passengers on the Narragansett was John Riley of the Cincinnati Stars, who was en route to Providence to meet up with his team. After the collision, Riley put a life preserver on and jumped overboard. He was in the water for over an hour. At first, the trains ran only 3 times a week and stopped only at East Greenwich, Kingston, and Westerly. By the spring of 1838, there were 2 trains in each direction on weekdays. The steamboat train, which connected with the New York boat, and the accommodation train, which handled the local business. When the latter was added to the schedule, the Providence Trail noted that it would also stop at Apponeok, Wickford, and Charleston to land and receive passengers. The road's Providence terminal was located on the west bank of the Providence River opposite the Boston and Providence's India Point terminal, and the ferry enabled passengers to transfer between the 2 roads. For a number of years, the trains had to be hauled from the Stonington town line to the steamboat wharf by horses, as the town had passed a law while the railroad was under construction prohibiting the operation of steam locomotives within its borders. Go figure. Providence began to attain importance as a railroad center with the 1847 arrival of the Providence and Worcester Railroad, and the road's completion the following year of the largest passenger station in the country. Union Passenger Depot was constructed on filled land on the south side of the Great Salt Cove in the middle of the present Kennedy Plaza, with both the Boston and Providence and the New York Providence and Boston rerouting their approaches to Providence in order to reach the new facility. The depot was also one of the country's first Union stations, serving all 3 of the city's railroads. Passengers could now travel from Boston to Stonington without changing trains. Constructed from plans by architect Thomas Teft while he was still a student at Brown University, the Union Passenger Depot was voted one of the best designer buildings in the country after it had been in use for 37 years. The Providence and Worcester serves the heavily industrialized Blackstone River corridor and soon replaced the Blackstone Canal, which had been in use for only 20 years. Not only were the trains faster than the canal boats, but the railroads did not freeze over in winter or suspend operation for lack of water during dry summers. At Worcester, the Western Railroad, later the Boston and Albany, provided the Providence and Worcester with a potentially profitable connection with the West. Trains began running between Providence and Hartford over the Hartford, Providence, and Fishkill Railroad in 1854. The ultimate destination of this line was the Hudson River and a connection with the New York and Erie Railroad, which is expected to interchange a substantial volume of freight to and from the west. By the time it finally reached the Hudson in 1881, the road had become part of the New York and New England Railroad, which eventually became one of the major systems in the region. The first railroad to serve the East Bay area, the Providence and Bristol, later the Providence, Warren, and Bristol, began operation in 1855. From Bristol, passengers could reach Quinnipiac Island, Newport by ferry. In 1865, the Fall River, Warren, and Providence Railroads opened its line from Fall River to Warren, where it connected with the Providence, Warren, and Bristol, thereby providing a rail between Providence and Fall River. Fall River was reached by ferry from Brayton Point in Swansea on the northerly side of the Taunton River until a bridge over the river was opened in 1876. A proposal for building a railroad from Fall River to Newport was welcomed by residents of Aquinic Island, but was strongly opposed by Fall River interests who feared that the status of the city would be reduced to that of a way station between Boston and Newport. The Rhode Island General Assembly chartered the Newport and Fall River Railroad in 1846 and approved its construction from Newport to the Massachusetts state line, but Massachusetts withheld approval of construction on its side of the border for a number of years. The venture had the backing of the Old Colony and Fall River Railroad, which wished to move the terminus of its affiliated Fall River line of steamers from Fall River to Newport, thereby shortening the overnight boat trip to New York. On 5th August 1863, the stockholders of the Old Colony and Fall River and the Newport and Fall River approved the merger of the two companies, and the railroad between Fall River and Newport was built by the Old Colony and Fall River at its Newport extension. Upon completion of the road, the name of the merged companies was changed to the Old Colony and Newport Railroad. The first train reached Newport on 1st February 1864. The railroad bought a new locomotive to run between Fall River and Newport and named its extension, a gesture that some residents of Fall River, now a private steamboat terminal, regarded as an act of spite. The terminal was moved back to Fall River following a change in the boat's line's ownership in 1869, although the boats continued to stop at Newport. Trains had begun operating over an all-rail route between Boston and New York, with the completion of the New York and New Haven Railroad in 1849. These trains did not pass through Rhode Island, however, as the tracks that crossed the state extended only from Boston to Stonington at this time. Instead, the trains ran over an inland route by way of Springfield and Hartford. Another 10 years passed before Rhode Island travelers could reach New York over the route that became known as the Shoreline. In 1859, the Shoreline route between Boston and New York required travel over tracks of 5 different railroads, including within Rhode Island those of the Boston and Providence and the New York Providence and Boston. Although 2 passengers were able to complete the trip without changing trains, the cars had to be ferried across the unbridged Thames and Connecticut rivers. Since this was a time-consuming operation, most Boston and New York trains continued to bypass Rhode Island and use the inland route through Springfield and Hartford. After traveling on a Shoreline train on a second visit to the United States in 1867, Charles Dickens penned an account of his disconcerting experience at one of the river crossings. Quote unquote, 2 rivers have to be crossed, and each time the whole train is banged aboard a big steamer. The steamer rises and falls with the river, which the railroad don't do, and the train is either banged uphill or banged downhill. And coming off the steamer at one of these crossings yesterday, we were banged to such a height that the rope broke and our carriage rushed back with a run downhill into the boat again. I whisked out in a moment and 1 or 2 others with me, but nobody else seemed to care about it. Quote, unquote. A bridge over the Connecticut River was completed in 1870, but the ferry across the Thames River between Groton and London was not replaced until 1889. The Thames River Bridge was built by the New York, Providence, and Boston Railroad, whose rails had been extended to Groton in 1864 when it purchased the tracks of the bankrupt New Haven, New London, and Stonington Railroad between Stonington and Groton. With the opening of the bridge at the time, the largest steel drawbridge in the world, the Shoreline, with its virtual absence of grades, became the primary through rail route between Boston and New York. This development had a significant effect on Rhode Island railroads, as it was instrumental in bringing the New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad to Rhode Island. The New Haven, as it was commonly called, was created in 1872 by a merger of the New York and New Haven and the Hartford and New Haven Railroads. The New Haven adopted a strategy of eliminating competition by acquiring beaten roads and by preventing the construction of new lines that might threaten its interests. Eventually, this strategy resulted in the integration of virtually all the railroads of southern New England into the New Haven system. In 1887, the New Haven owned 450 miles of track. By the end of the 19th century, the tracks of the monopoly, as it was sometimes called, the Province Journal called it the Connecticut Octopus, had grown to 2,470 miles. The New Haven was especially desirous of obtaining access to Boston over its own rails instead of being dependent on trackage rights over other roads. The first step in this direction had actually been taken before the formation of the New York, New Haven, and Hartford, when the New York and New Haven extended its rails to New London in 1870 by leasing the Shoreline Railroad. The New Haven deferred its next move toward Boston until after New York, Providence, and Boston had built and paid for the Thames River Bridge. Then its leasing of that line in 1892 extended the New Haven tracks to Providence. The lease brought the eminent financier J.P. Morgan, a director of the New York, Providence, and Boston, to the New Haven's board of directors, and he would soon become its dominant member. The lease also brought the Providence and Worcester Railroad, which the New York, Providence, and Boston had leased in 1888, under New Haven control. With the leasing of the New York, Providence, and Boston, the New Haven advanced to within 44 miles of its goals. Those 44 miles were controlled by the Old Colony Railroad. Newport had been dropped from the road's name in 1872, which anticipated that the New Haven would eventually need to acquire the Boston and Providence as a final step, extending its rails to Boston, had leased that line in 1888, gaining a strong position for the negotiations that were to follow. In 1893, the New Haven leased the Old Colony's entire 600-mile system, most of which was situated in southeastern Massachusetts. In order to gain control of the vital 44 miles of track between Providence and Boston, the terms of the lease were advantageous for the Old Colony, but they proved to be a financial drain on the New Haven in later years. The New York and New England Railroad was incorporated in 1873, a year after the formation of the New Haven. The road hereafter referred to as the New England was formed during the reorganization of the Boston, Hartford, and Erie Railroad, whose scandalous financial mismanagement had led to insolvency in 1870. Despite its recurrent financial problems, the New England managed to cobble together a system that reached most of the major cities of southern New England, including Providence. The relationship between the New England and the New Haven was complex, and it degenerated from cooperative to adversarial once the New Haven began taking steps to gain control of the New England, which had become its principal rival. Among the railroads included in the New England system at the time of its formation was the Hartford, Providence, and Fishkill. Side note, that's what ran through here in Rhode Island. Work on whose project extension to the Hudson River had come to a halt at Waterbury, Connecticut in 1855, owing to lack of funds. Future Rhode Island Governor William Sprague, the president of the railroad at the time, was covering its losses through loans from the A&W Sprague Investment and Banking Company, his own firm. The Boston, Hartford, and Erie, which opened the Hartford, Providence, and Fishkill during the later half of the 1860s, resumed work on the Hudson River extension but failed to complete it before going bankrupt. The extension was finally finished in 1881 by the New England, which built a huge steam ferry to transport freight cars across the Hudson between Fishkill Landing and the Erie Railroad's terminal at Newburgh. The New England Main Line, which originated at Boston, did not pass through Rhode Island, although a short connection to Woonsocket enabled some main line trains to serve that city. The New England's principal route in Rhode Island was the line between Providence and Willimantic, Connecticut, cut 26 miles of which were within Rhode Island. Originally the eastern end of the Hartford, Providence, and Fishkill, this route joined the main line at Willimantic and was known for a time as the Providence Division. The New England's other Rhode Island routes were located in the northern part of the state. In 1877, it began operating trains between Providence and Boston over its Providence extension. These trains traveled over the Providence and Worcester from Providence to Valley Falls, where they switched to the tracks of the Rhode Island in Massachusetts, a 14-mile road connecting at Franklin, Massachusetts, with the New England's main line to Boston. Since the Rhode Island and Massachusetts did not own any rolling stock, it entered into an agreement with the New England for the operation of its road. But New England intended to build its own line from Providence to Valley Falls. Those plans were never realized, and the 6-mile gap between Providence and Valley Falls continued to be covered by trackage rights over Providence and Worcester. Although the New England's Providence and Boston trains were in competition with the established Boston and Providence route, they seemed to have little effect on the latter's business. Perhaps because the New England's route was somewhat longer and the trains ran less frequently. It is rather a pathetic commentary on the traffic of this route, observes the history of New England railroad systems, that it is not once protested against in the annual reports of the Boston and Providence Railroad, in whose traffic actually made some noticeable shrinkage. On 11 August 1873, the Providence and Springfield Railroad began service between Providence and Pasco. Chartered in 1857 as the Woonsocket Railroad, it changed its name in 1871 to publicize its intention of extending its railroad beyond the borders of Rhode Island. Its original plan was to reach Springfield over the tracks of the Boston and Albany Railroad by means of a connection at Palmer, Massachusetts, but the railroad was unable to acquire the financial resources to carry out this plan. The Providence and Springfield had not advanced its rails beyond Pasco when it was leased by the New England in October 1890. When the most desirable route for the Providence Springfield was being decided during the 1860s, a committee appointed to study the possibilities recommended that the road pass through Woonsocket rather than through Pasco as originally proposed. Although the route through Pasco was chosen, a branch from North Smithfield to Woonsocket was to have been built as soon as the main line reached Pasco. That plan too remained unfulfilled because of a lack of money. Eventually, Woonsocket was linked with the Providence and Springfield by the Woonsocket and Pasco Railroad, incorporated in 1889 after both roads had been leased by the New England. By 1863, the New York and Boston Airline Railroad, which was attempting to build a through route from Boston to New York, had reached Woonsocket, but the construction came to a halt. The main reason why the road abandoned its grandiose plan, that its principal rival, the Boston and New York Central, was pursuing the same objective over a parallel route and had made sufficient progress to convince the management of the New York and Boston of the futility of extending its road beyond Woonsocket. Both roads became part of the Boston, Hartford, and Erie in 1864, but that company never completed the through road to New York. When the Boston, Hartford, and Erie was reorganized as the New York and New England in 1873, the former New York and Boston route between Boston and Woonsocket became the New England's Woonsocket Division. On 21 May 1889, the Woonsocket and Pasco Railroad was incorporated for the purpose of extending the Woonsocket Division to serve communities and industries in the North Smithfield and Butterville. On April 1, 1891, a month before the road was opened, it was leased by the New England, with which it connected at Harrisville, miles east of Pasco, providing a link between the New England's Woonsocket Division and its Providence and Springfield line. The Woonsocket and Pasco gave the New England its long-sought route between Providence and Boston over its own rails. A few Woonsocket Division passengers trains offered through service between Boston and Pasco. Otherwise, the route between Providence and Boston was suitable only for freight, since it was approximately 30 miles longer than the Boston and Providence route between the two cities. In spite of its worsening financial condition, on June 11, 1893, the New England managed to open a 7-mile extension from Pasco to a point on its main line between Douglas, Massachusetts, and East Thompson, Connecticut. At East Thompson, the New England Southbridge branch provided a connection between the main line and the Norwich Division, thereby giving the extension access to the various roads that converged at Worcester. This extension The last new track to be built on Rhode Island gave the New England the potential to realize the Providence and Springfield's goal of connecting with roads that would enable it to serve as a bridge line between Providence and points north and west of Rhode Island. In 1887, Charles P. Clark became president of the New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad. Clark had been general manager of the New York and New England during the 1870s and had served as its president from 1882 until 1886. His astute management brought a measure of stability to the chaotic situation that the New England had inherited from the Boston, Hartford, and Erie. His years of experience with New England had convinced him that the New England and New Haven should be consolidated to a single system, an objective that he pursued as president of the later railroad. The New Haven employed a number of tactics to engineer the New England's financial collapse. The most damaging of these was the diversion of interline freight traffic from the New England by forwarding it to its destination over other roads after it left the New Haven rails. The New Haven also thwarted the New England's efforts to secure access to New York City over tracks other than New Haven's. Meanwhile, New Haven director J.P. Morgan had been buying up New England stock, which he later offered to the New Haven at cost. The New England was declared bankrupt on 27 December 1893. When the New York and New England emerged from bankruptcy in 1895, it had a new name, the New England Railroad, and Charles P. Clark, the president of the old New Haven, was president of the New England as well. In his report for the year, in 1895, the Railroad Commission of Rhode Island commented favorably on its development. It is expected that great advantage for both roads will result from the change. Competition that in some cases helped neither road nor the public will be done away with. In many cases, expenses can be reduced by one set of officers active for both roads. Freight facilities can be satisfactorily arranged and used for mutual advantage. The change cannot fail to be of benefit to the general public, though in perhaps some cases private interests may suffer for a time. There is great work to be done in improvements in rolling stock, road beds, station houses, and other matters before the New England Railroad can take its place as a first-class road. There is every prospect that this result will eventually be attained, so it will require years of hard work and careful management to acquire it. The New Haven completed its conquest of the New England in 1898 by Leeson Road, which was merged into the New Haven system in 1908. By 1895, 60 years after the Boston Providence began operation, there were almost 500 miles of track in Rhode Island, over 21 of which were controlled by the New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad. 21 miles that were not under New Haven control belonged to four short line railroads. Rhode Island railroads carried 52,339,355 passengers and transported 13,196,828 tons of freight in 1895. Owing to competition from the electric streetcar, the railroads had 486,996 fewer passengers in 1895 than they had in 1894. A decrease noted the Railroad Commissioner very much smaller than that of the preceding year. Hey, greetings fans, all 19 of you and whoever else watches. I'm Jim, or Jimmy from Rhode Island's Hidden History. Welcome to my YouTube channel. So far we have 19 subscribers. I just uploaded a video of the old Phoenix Cemetery. My first foray into doing cemetery work. Officially like that. Got quite a few interesting things coming up. Try to look into Edward P. Taylor's family. He is the Black Civil War veteran that moved here to Rhode Island and raised a family here and died here and worked in the local mills. Some things have gotten more interest than others. Burnside, he's not a big favorite. The big one is going to be the old Phoenix Mill. A lot of mills here to look up. Coming up tomorrow is the biggest one I've got yet, is about the railroads. Some nice slides on it and stuff. It'll be good. I'm excited about that. Um, I'm sorry for the ums. But that's just me trying how I think. So it's been an adventure. I mean, I love history. I've loved history since high school. I did pretty well in American history. It was the only history I took back then. But in the late 90s, I started getting interested in family history. I had heard rumors from my father's brothers that the plumbers had come over here. I was like 20 years after the Pilgrims and landed and settled in Newbury, Massachusetts, and that piqued my interest. But you know, at that age, you don't start asking questions. I heard that my uncle had done some research on it, but that has been long lost, and he has passed on a long time ago. So in the late 90s, I got a CD kit for doing family history, and I've been doing it ever since, off and on. Uh, what got me interested here in Rhode Island history is that, you know, I have done find a grave stuff in the past, you know, looking up cemetery, I'm sorry, grave sites or gravestones in the past, and posting them on the site there on Find a Grave. The bike path I ride on a lot used to be the part of the New England and Providence, Hartford and Fishkill Railroad that I've been researching, and I've just been very interested in all that. A lot of little Rhode Island history here that I found out. I mean, the cemetery that I just explored was the Atwood Cemetery. That the Atwood family is the one that was buried in there, and looking up the Phoenix Mill, I found out there was the Atwood Estate, which was torn down in the 1860s. So I have to look up that now. Another little piece of history. So it's all for the good. And a lot more interesting things to come. So stay tuned. I just ask you to like and subscribe and comment if you feel like to. And I'll talk to you later. Thank you very much.